I call the member for Murray.
I thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I too rise to speak on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander People's Recognition Sunset Extension Bill of 2015. This bill is very important for the nation of Australia, and it has, I have no doubt, bipartisan support. It comes about because we had in 2013 the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander People's Recognition Act, an act that came into Parliament, and for the first time the continent and the islands, now known as Australia, were deemed to be first occupied by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. In other words, we recognised that Indigenous Australians existed, and that was through the Parliamentary Act. I've always had problems with the word occupied. I mean, my family farms have been the family for 6 generations. We never refer to that as occupied by the family. We say we owned it. I don't know why we have this incredible difficulty in Australia in using the word owned when it comes to the Indigenous Australians and the continent itself. So let me, for the sake of the record, say that we in fact should recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples owned their tribal areas, their countries, their nations, whether they were as island states in the Torres Strait or on mainland Australia. And in owning their country, they had them, it was in fact divided up into some 200 or so separate nations on the mainland. But the issue now is that we need to have the recognition of Australia's Indigenous ownership of the country recognised in the Constitution. Now, that Act in 2013 gave us a 2-year sunset for the referendum to be placed and ideally supported so that we could have the Constitution changed, and it would then give us this recognition that we all, I think, in this place believe is deserved. It's just a no-brainer in any other sense of the word. The difficulty for us is that on the 27th of March 2014, a review panel was set up in accordance with the Act, and the review panel has reported back on the 19th of September 2014 that in their view we need to extend that sunset by a year to make it 3 years so that there is less likelihood of the referendum being not supported by the majority of Australian people. It's a fairly complex matter. We've got to make sure that the final proposal is understood by both the Indigenous Australians, parliaments and the people. We've got to make sure that it is not contentious in any way, that it is just understood as the right thing for Australians to do. So we have a result similar to that which we achieved on the 27th of May 1967. At that referendum, we had 5,700,000 Australians vote yes, which was 91% favourable for the proposal that Indigenous Australians could now have laws made for them in the federal sphere, in this Parliament, and it also talked about ensuring that Australian Indigenous people were counted in the census. Now, that was an overwhelmingly supported referendum. We want to have the same result for this referendum, and that's why it would be a shame, we all agree, if we went to the people too soon before all of the work has been done. And that's why I very strongly support this amendment. Let's extend this time frame, that's why this is called a sunset extension bill, to a third year so that we can properly acknowledge our shared history, the incredible value we place on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people and their heritage. And I would hope we should be acknowledging the ownership of the country before colonisation and the continued ownership of parts of it by the Indigenous Australians. I want to put a little bit of history into this debate because I think it's always important to know where we've come from, how we've evolved in our thinking about Indigenous Australians. Some people don't understand that we don't, in fact, at this point in time have a very how shall I put it, a very commendable history in relation to recognising the rights of Indigenous Australians in the modern Australia. So I want to quote you from the Statutes of Western Australia, 1944. It's the Native Citizenship Rights Act, And this is where they've decided in Western Australia to in fact grant a certificate of citizenship to Aboriginal people on certain conditions, and it could be withdrawn upon certain conditions. So let me read you from section 4(1). It says, any adult person who is a native within the meaning of the Native Administration Act 1905 to 1941 may make application for a certificate of citizenship to a resident or stipendiary magistrate or government resident in the magisterial district in which he resides. And it goes on to say that in order for this to occur, to make an application, by the date of the application, the person making the application has to show they've dissolved tribal and native association, except with respect to lineal descendants or native relations of the first degree. In other words, your mum and dad you can continue to talk to, and perhaps your children, but anyone beyond that degree of relationship should be disassociated with forthwith. The person may also have served in the Navy, Air Force or Army. At least that acknowledges that more than 1,000 Indigenous Australians were in the First World War fighting for their country, bravely, courageously, beside the non-Indigenous Australians, and also, we talk about 1944, were also at that time looking to again defend Australia. So if you had served in the Air Force, Navy or Army, you could be entitled to citizenship, as long as you received an honourable discharge. You also had to show you're a proper and fit person to get this certificate. So what did that mean? It said that for the 2 years immediately prior, the applicant had to have adopted the manner and habits of civilised life. The full rights of citizenship have to be seen as desirable for and likely to be conducive to the welfare of the applicant. The applicant is able to speak and understand the English language. The applicant is not suffering from active leprosy, syphilis, granuloma or yaws, and the applicant is of industrious habits and is of good behaviour and reputation. It's interesting that we still don't require a lot of our new citizens to be able to speak English. But certainly in 1944, the Western Australian Indigenous person had to demonstrate that. Now, this certificate of citizenship could, of course, be withdrawn. The way that it could be withdrawn would be if any person, a complaint could be made by the Commission of Native Affairs or any person. On that complaint, a magistrate can suspend or cancel a certificate of citizenship if he's satisfied that the holder is not adopting the manner and habits of civilised life or has been twice convicted of any offence under the Native Administration Act 1905 to 41, or is of habitual drunkenness, or has contracted leprosy, syphilis, granuloma or yaws. And given that upon being granted citizenship, this native or Aboriginal would be deemed to no longer be a native or Aboriginal and shall have instead all the rights, privileges and immunities and shall be subject to the duties and liabilities of a natural born or naturalised subject of His Majesty. Should this citizenship be withdrawn, revoked if you like, then once again that person shall be deemed to be a native or Aborigine for all the purposes of the Native Administration Act 1905 to 41 or any other act. Now I find this extraordinary as we today debate very carefully whether or not we can, or the morality of withdrawing citizenship from someone who has dual citizenship on the basis of a terrorist act. And yet in 1944 we were quite comfortable, it would seem, given this legislation, to withdraw citizenship from an Indigenous Australian on the basis that they'd contracted a disease, had been drunken, or in any other way had been seen not to be living a civilised life. So I'm making this point to demonstrate how far we have evolved in the 70 or so years since Indigenous Australians were not considered to be Australians in any sense of the word. We've come a very long way, even though the Closing the Gap report of last week demonstrates that we still have a huge distance to cover in terms of the capacity of an Indigenous Australian to lead a life that is any way comparable in terms of health, employment, safety, freedom from discrimination, or indeed having similar levels of incarceration to non-Indigenous Australians. We've got so far to go, but I want to make the point that it was only in 1944 where we thought it was quite appropriate to require an Aboriginal Australian to deny their Aboriginality in order to get a piece of paper which allowed them to vote or to drink, but another condition was they no longer associated with their family unless they were an immediate family, mother, father, son or daughter. And we have some very famous cases, and this Citizenship Act, by the way, was also promulgated in like-minded states at about the same time. We had the very sad case of our very famous painter, Albert Namatjura, who was first given and then had his citizenship checked because he chose to share alcohol with some of his relatives at the time. So I'm strongly supporting that we, in fact, extend the time for Australians to be educated about the need for the referendum to be passed absolutely unanimously, if that would be humanly possible in Australia with a referendum, in embracing a constitutional amendment which would recognise the unique status of Australia's Indigenous peoples. We must acknowledge our shared history. We must acknowledge the bad parts of our history so that we don't continue to blame the victim, as we often do in Australia today. We've got to acknowledge that for Indigenous Australians, the first 100 years at least, since 1788, were marred or made desperate by warfare between themselves, the native police, some frontier settlers and pastoralists who were, in one case, trying to defend their country and their own peoples. On the other hand, the pastoralists, the new settlers, were trying to defend their own lives too and their flocks and their possessions. We've got to acknowledge that warfare. We've got to acknowledge the fact that Indigenous Australians were pushed off their land onto places where they did not belong or country they did not own themselves, which caused further distress between competing Indigenous nations, which led to more warfare, more bloodshed. We've got to acknowledge the poverty, the degradation, the lack of employment, the disease that does typify a lot of that early contact history. But at the same time, we've got to acknowledge that there were triumphant parts. There were the times for about, again, a century when Australian Aboriginal Indigenous peoples were indispensable in white settlement of remote Australia, the pastoral industry. They were the stockmen, the managers of very remote places. They were great managers of livestock, husbanding livestock in difficult circumstances. We've got to acknowledge the women, the Indigenous women, who were pioneers in every sense with the white Australians at the time in the work they did in domestic work, often also as stock women, but still at the same time surviving in extremely difficult conditions and raising their families. We've got to acknowledge the terrible period when we thought it was wise to take away children of mixed descent because we thought that white blood gave them the right, which is how we explain it at the time often, to be raised as whites, or we felt that they would be contaminated and further degraded or discriminated against or neglected if they stayed with their Indigenous mother, who was often living in impoverished and dire circumstances in remote or even city places. We've got to acknowledge all of that so that we can understand why today a lot of Indigenous Australians and Islanders and Aboriginal people are drinking at high risk levels, are using drugs of dependence, are in despair with their rates of suicide, gender-based violence, the rates of incarceration. If we understand our history, we can then put into greater context why Indigenous Australians are, as they are today, in great distress very often. The inquiry I chair into high-risk use of alcohol in Indigenous communities is so often distressed by the evidence we take, the distress of these Indigenous communities that is conveyed to us by speaker after speaker, most recently in Cairns just last week. We've got to do better. Part of our need is to recognise Indigenous Australians, their rights, their responsibilities, their unique status in our society as owners of this country before we arrived, and giving another year to make sure Australians understand that. So the referendum is a resounding success, is what this amendment will, or this new bill will allow us to do.